Good morning. It's not raining. It seems like the last few times we had these during the spring, it was raining, and now we have a beautiful day. So thank you so much for attending Aspire. We have a great program today for you. It's on the update for oil and gas. So I know everybody's going to be interested in hearing that. It affects our economy so dramatically. So after we hear all of our good information today, we'll know exactly how to invest our stocks. So we are in our 26th year at Chapman Hext, and so we're excited to be being successful, and that all is because of you guys. So we thank you, and thanks for attending Aspire this morning. So in front of you are the programs for today. And you have your evaluations for CPE, if you'll fill that in and turn it in at the desk when you leave. And then you also have the evaluations for Aspire. So fill those in. And so today our speakers are Reid Thompson and Haley Edwards. And so I will turn the program over to them and let them give you all the good information.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let me say good morning again and welcome. Thank you all for coming out. I want to introduce, I'm Reid Thompson with East West Bank. This is Haley Edwards. I'll let her give a little introduction.
I'm Haley Edwards. I joined the bank actually in May, so it's only been a few months, but that's after 10 years with a couple of previous institutions, all here in Dallas in oil and gas lending. So we are a newer bank to the oil and gas market. So we entered the Texas market a couple of years ago and really ramping up since September of last year into the oil and gas market. So exciting opportunities for us right now. And I'll let Reid continue.
Again, Reid Thompson, I'm Senior Relationship Manager for East West Bank. I joined the bank in January. We started making oil and gas loans last September, as Haley said. I left Wells Fargo Bank after 15 years. I've actually been in oil and gas lending for about 35 years. So I've seen a few up and down cycles. I've seen $10 oil twice. I've seen 90-cent natural gas. So I have a lot of experience in oil and gas lending with a lot of different institutions. So we'll get into it a little bit later in the discussion. But the regulators changed our world earlier this year. So a lot of things that we've done for the past 30 years are no longer applicable. The fundamentals are still the same, but it's kind of changed our business model a little bit. And I want to thank our sponsor, Chapman Hext, for inviting us out. I don't know how they found us.
Right.
We're in the adjacent suite on the 8th floor over in the West Tower, so that's how they became familiar with East West. It's not on the agenda, but I wanted to give you a little intro to East West Bank. I think the biggest misconception is that we're somehow owned by the Chinese. It is true that 45 years ago, the bank started as a federal savings bank to cater to Chinese American businesses in Southern California. We are headquartered in Pasadena, California, but we're the 23rd largest publicly traded bank in the country. And so nobody owns more than 1.5% of our stock. And we're about $34 billion in assets. So it's not a small institution. It's what you might call a mid-sized regional bank. We came to Texas 2 years ago when we made an acquisition of Metro Banks down in Houston. They did have 3 branches in the Dallas market. So beginning with that, the management in Pasadena said, well, we're in Texas, we might as well be in the oil and gas lending business. So fortunately, we missed $140 oil and we came into the market at $40 oil. So needless to say, we don't have any problem loans. I don't have the regulators on my back. We don't have a workout group. So we're taking advantage of assets changing hands and financing new transactions. That's principally our business model today. So jumping into the basics, crude oil. You know, as you always see crude oil quoted in terms of dollars per barrel. Well, obviously as consumers, we don't buy a barrel of crude oil. The first purchaser for the crude oil is the refining business. And this is an illustration very simple illustration of what we call an atmospheric crude unit, which is the starting point in the refining process. So as you can see, all the crude oil goes into the tower at about 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, and as it cools, the molecules rise up in the tower and they're drained off at particular levels to generate these different products. Now for crude oil, as you can see, the middle slate of this product set is transportation fuel. So the highest and best use for crude oil is in the transportation fuel sector. At the lower end of the molecule chain, you have road tar and asphalt, and at the upper end, you've got the natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas products that come out of the top of the tower. It's important to note that there hasn't been a new refinery built in the United States in the last 40 years. I mean, who wants one of those stinky, nasty things in your backyard? So what we're dealing with is older technology, older configurations, and that is important for later on in our conversation when we talk a little bit more about crude oil. Now, natural gas is almost wholly a domestic product. It's produced in certain regions of the country and consumed in generally different regions of the country. Now, it's a mature business, so the infrastructure from getting gas from the producing region to the consuming region is fairly well built out. It's fairly efficient. So as you can see from this pie chart, about 35% of natural gas is used for electric power generation. And that's probably natural gas's highest and best use. That's followed by industrial manufacturing and residential consumption. Rounding out the pie chart is commercial activities, which is commercial buildings, and the rest of it, about 10% of the gas is actually consumed in the process of producing it and transporting it to the market. Then on the larger power segment, you can see the different sources of power being petroleum, natural gas, coal, renewable energy, which you see a lot in the headlines, and nuclear power. Now, right now, natural gas is about 28% of the market. You can see that increasing because gas is plentiful. The price is low because the supply-demand is a little bit out of balance. Coal, on the other hand, as you see from the headlines, is becoming disfavored, and you'll see the coal percentage of the power sources shrink and be supplanted by natural gas. Renewables at 10%. Renewables have their limitations, and I personally don't see the renewable energy sector getting much larger than the mid-teens in terms of its contribution to the overall power source. Nuclear ought to be fairly static at 8 to 10% because there's not going to be a whole lot of new plants being commissioned in the nuclear space. As you can see how the percentages line out, natural gas, its highest and best use is for power generation and heating residences and businesses. Petroleum, on the other hand, its highest and best use is as a transportation fuel, as you can see with the 71% contribution. Now, I know we have a question and answer page for the back end of this presentation, but if you have a question, just feel free to ask it. Now, the factors impacting natural gas prices, again, it's principally a domestic product produced in one region and consumed in another. There's adequate pipeline infrastructure to get gas from one place to the other. Very little gas is imported. We'll talk a little bit later about LNG, liquefied natural gas, and the infrastructure was originally built out to receive LNG shipments into the country before the shale revolution created a surplus domestic supply of natural gas, and now that's being retooled and turned around to where we're actually going to be exporting, we'd be a net exporter of liquefied natural gas. Now, gas is a seasonal product, and it's also, its price is dependent upon economic growth and the price of competing fuels. There's not a lot of fuel switching capabilities, some from crude oil to natural gas, not a lot from coal to natural gas. So the fuel switching is not going to be a big factor on natural gas prices going forward. As I mentioned, or maybe I didn't, crude oil is a global commodity. It's traded in US dollars. That was determined back in the early 1970s when the US dollar was considered to be the reserve currency of the world. Everybody wanted to be in US dollars. So that still is prevalent today. Almost all crude oil is traded in US dollars, which, to the second bullet, a stronger or weaker dollar is going to affect on the margin the price of a barrel of crude. A stronger dollar buys more barrels, so the price per barrel goes down. In fact, so every time you see the dollar strengthen against the sterling or the euro or the yen, you should see a corresponding downward impact on crude oil prices. Now, on the supply-demand, big in the headlines, big news the last couple of years. Again, our domestic activities and the shale revolution, as I refer to it, created a supply on the domestic side, which has created, it'll be on a slide later, the United States is now the largest producer of petroleum and petroleum-related products in the world. We finally surpassed Saudi Arabia and Russia for that distinction. And so with that, and then a global slowdown in economic activity has created, as you read in the headlines, a surplus of supply in crude oil. So right now we have a depressed oil price that probably is going to be range bound between $40 and $50 a barrel for the next 6 months to a year until the market is fairly stable right now. There's some balancing between supply and demand. I think that needs to persist for a period of time, again 6 months to a year, before we'll see prices much above $50 a barrel. That's my personal outlook. That's not the official position of East West Bank. And of course, the rig count is big in the headlines. It is directly correlated with what the value of the product is. So we've seen some gains in rig count directly related to crude oil being above $45 a barrel towards $50 a barrel. Some of it is just people have to work their rigs. They have leases that they have that if they're not drilled, they will have to surrender them at some point in the future. So whether it's economic or not, or on the margin, some operators are having to put rigs to work just to preserve assets. And I've mentioned the shale revolution a couple of times. These are the major shale basins in the lower 48 states. I think it all started out with just north of Fort Worth. The Barnett Shale was the first big shale play in the country. It was a gas shale play. The technology that was applied there in terms of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing were new to the business. I mean, we had both horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing for decades. This was the first time that the two were combined to break down the shale rock to produce reserves that we've known were there for a long period of time. They were just not commercially viable to produce at the price at the time, given the technology. That extended over into Louisiana, into the Haynesville Shale, which further extended into the Pennsylvania, Marcellus, and Utica shales. And then they decided, okay, let's try to apply this technology that we've learned in these gas shales to oil. So up in North Dakota, up in the Bakken, that was the first oil shale, big oil shale development. Heard a lot of news about the Bakken. It's remote. You know, the only way to get oil from the Bakken down to the Gulf Coast where the refining capacity is by truck or by rail. So again, we've seen many headlines about putting crude oil on rail. So, and it's important to note that we've known these shales were here for, like I said, decades. The problem is that we refer to this as source rock. It's where the hydrocarbons originated and so they're naturally more depleted than the conventional reservoirs that have basically all been found. You know, the reason we're producing shale rock today is because all the easy oil has already been found and is basically on production. As I alluded to, the shale revolution, particularly in oil, has created the United States as being the top petroleum producer in the world, followed by OPEC, with Russia, the one standout. We're going to talk a little bit about Haley. We'll touch on OPEC and its impact to the markets, but this is a fairly new phenomenon. And this is a question that begs asking, okay, if we're the largest producer of petroleum in the world, why are we still importing 7 million barrels of oil a day? Well, the problem is, as I alluded to earlier, is that the refining capacity in the United States is at least 40 years old, sometimes 60 years old. And when the refineries were configured, they were configured to process a particular type of crude. Not all crude is created equal. You have sour crude that comes out of Venezuela and Mexico. You have light sweet crude that is produced up in the Bakken and in West Texas. So since we were a net importer of over 50% of our crude needs for a long period of time, the refining capacity was geared towards producing that particular kind of barrel. Now, with the advent of the light sweet crude coming in, there is only a certain amount of blending you can do with the light crude quality and the heavy crude quality in order to continue to run the refining business at a maximum capacity. And because of that, we still need to import heavier crudes to blend with our light crude feedstock in order to keep the refining business moving. And the problem with that is to retool a refinery or to build a new refinery, you'd have to comply with all the new EPA and government regulations, which just simply makes it uneconomic to go in that direction of retooling our refining capacity. And again, oil being a geopolitical animal as it relates to price, you can see back in the 50s and 60s, the price of crude oil was basically determined by what we call the Seven Sisters, or the original companies that form the major oil companies today. So they set the price. That was until 1973, when the United States backed the Israelis in the Yom Kippur War, and the Arabs created the Arab oil embargo. Now, what happened with that is the United States says, okay, we're overly dependent upon foreign crude, so we're going to develop the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And so a lot of oil went into filling up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as the price rose. And as you can see on the timeline, the different international geopolitical events and some of the financial events that happened here lately have caused the price to fluctuate wildly. And in a lot of these cases where you see OPEC cuts 4.2 million barrels from the daily supply, supporting price. Back in November of 2014, Saudi Arabia decided to no longer be the swing producer and to expand or contract crude oil production in order to maintain a stable market price. So with that, you saw the tremendous crude oil drop from $100 a barrel down to $26 a barrel just this last February. So they tried to Well, their thought was they could push it back on us now that we're the largest producer of petroleum in the world, that we might become the swing producer, or they might damage our industry somehow by letting the price fall so precipitously. Now, again, the market's beginning to rebalance. There's only about 500,000 to 1 million barrels a day of imbalance within the markets, the global markets. We feel like that most of the producing countries in the world are at or near capacity, so there's not a lot of ability. A lot of it's guesswork. You know, a lot of the experts say that Saudi Arabia only has 1 million to 1.5 million a day of excess capacity that they could bring to the market. Iran is trying to ramp up, but they're only about 200,000 barrels a day from being at their maximum production capabilities, at least with their infrastructure as it is today.